Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Fortress. Your data is traveling. Shouldn't your security? Stories from the street with a cybersecurity veteran webinar hosted by Wade Barasoff, our Director of Product Management at Fortress Data Protection. My name is Mike Guerin, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. And just before I hand things over to Wade, if you have any questions you think of during the session that you'd like to ask, please submit them via the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to answer as many as possible at the end. But that's it for me now, so I'm going to hand things over to Wade, and we can get started.
All right, thank you, Mike, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining with us today. Appreciate you taking time out of your day, and we have a pretty packed 30-minute session here in which I have a lot of material to get through. And ideally, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to actually share experience. I've looked at sort of the thousands of experiences that I've had out in the field. I'm trying to share some things with you to help maybe shape some of your data protection, some of your data traveling experiences you may be having. And I want to give you the good stuff and the bad stuff. Our goal here is to make you walk away with a little bit more knowledge and maybe change how you're approaching what you're doing today. So as Mike had said, I am Director of Product here for Data Protection here at Fortra. I've been doing this about 10 years as far as just focusing on the data protection space, but for a number of years. So the experience I'm bringing to you is not as a vendor, it's actually as a consumer of products, and I'm actually blending in some of that vendor experience with it. So, the two things I always like to remind everybody that we always hear this thing about how data is the most valuable asset. I guess it overtook employees a number of years ago, but it's also your biggest liability, right? Because continuously, all you do is open up Google News or whatever news source you happen to have, and we're infiltrated with loss, accidents, things that people are doing that are continuing to send this most valuable asset to the wrong spot. So, what can we learn from other people's mistakes? What can we do? So I'm actually going to start off with a good story. This is a data loss save that happened at a company that I was helping with. And, what happened here, it was an organization with thousands and thousands of customers to support, individual customer support. A lot of valuable data, a lot of sensitive stuff. And someone actually took a role with the intention of getting into one of these roles that they can steal some of this data and send it off. So, kind of the what happened part. Well, there was a single individual that had multiple attempts, using multiple methods, and a sizable volume of data. So in this particular case, the organization had security controls in place, but this individual thought, well, I'm going to go and collect a bunch of this data through my role, and then I'm going to start trying all these different doors, see which one of the doors are unlocked. And what that did is that it generated a bunch of alerts. So security operations was alerted to, well, wait a second, what's going on here? Someone's banging around. And what we saw was the same amount of data, looked at the role that the person was in. The role wasn't something which they should be sharing volumes of data, and that alerted corporate security. The end part of this story is what we later found out is that the individual was actually trying to share the data with a spouse that was in jail for identity theft. And here's the crazy part. This is the second time I've had this story happen to me at a company, and I'm one person. I can't imagine that this is happening over and over and over again. But yeah, I guess if once a criminal, always a criminal kind of thing, right? So this was a scenario in which an individual actually intentionally took a role because they wanted to steal data, because they were good at identity theft. Well, I guess not so good at identity theft if they were in jail, right? So why did they get caught? What was special about this? In this particular organization, there was a strong partnership with legal compliance, privacy, and corporate security. So why was that important? Well, those are the folks that help you decide what it is that you're going to go look for. Because corporate policies, that big boring book or that big boring electronic book that we have to learn every year that we forget 30 seconds after we take the course, those are the folks that created, and that's actually what you're enforcing. And when done correctly, what is the difference between an insider threat and someone making a mistake? Usually volume. Either someone's trying something with a large amount of data at one time, or they're trying to drip it out to test all these different doors to see which door might be unlocked. But that's the difference between an insider and someone making a mistake. And it's really nuanced. But you don't have to write something that's very different for an insider threat versus an individual. It's actually usually the same policy. But the key to that is that you need to agree upon limits. And what limits all of a sudden trigger, hey, wait a second, this is something I should look at more. I have some examples here in the screen itself that, high are 50 to 500 records and, critical is 500 plus. You as an organization sitting down with all these partners, sit down and decide, well, what all of a sudden should get extra eyeballs? What all of a sudden should trigger a response? And when it does trigger that response, the key is being able to look across different tools and see what are these people doing. Like, for example, in this particular case, the first thing they tried was email. So we went and looked in Exchange and took a look at what they were trying to get, try to do and how they were trying to do it, where it was going. And it's really not hard to figure out when someone's trying to send something to a personal or private address. So the key on why these folks got caught, strong partnership, they had good policy in place, and they actually had set up different thresholds to alert them to, hey, this we have to pay attention to this now. And then they're able to quickly look across. So that's why this one was caught. And, I know that this is a scenario that to people on the call might be common, but to a lot of organizations I've worked with, it's not. This is actually new to them. So the next one I'm going to go is what I call research loss. And I tag this one as that may end up in the papers. And what this was is a research organization that operated globally. At the time, they had a lot of people working from home, and their clients were governments and universities, giving them millions of dollars to do research. And it's a combination of social research and some economic research was kind of factored in there. But basically, this company operated on grants. The environment was really loose. They were allowed to share on any tool that they wanted. There was almost no endpoint controls that were put in place other than some threat tools. But it was really, really loose. It was a really loose environment. And there's a reason for it. And so, I was there to try to help them. And I kind of felt like I had stepped back into the 1990s. Yes, I just aged myself. Because about all they were doing was virus scanning and threat scanning. That's about all they were doing. The funniest part for me is when they proudly informed me that they had written corporate policies that told people what not to do. And it brought a smile on my face because I'm just like, you realize that does absolutely nothing because pretty much no employee in an organization knows what your corporate policies are. But they were proud of that. So I was confused, well, why, how is it possible this organization survived this long? And when I was talking to them, I'm just like, I don't get how you made it this far without having loss or having loss show up in a public way. And they're like, well, that's actually why you're here, is that a bunch of our research was given to the New York Post, and the New York Post had posted it publicly, in which now all of that research, that paid for research was now available publicly, and they're rather embarrassed about it. And that's why I was there. They're kind of saying what we should do. So what was unique about this organization other than, they were operating in a very loose manner? There wasn't a lot of control in place. And the most obvious reason why they had loss was zero controls, written policies or nothing. But the most important part, it was corporate culture. The culture that drove this organization was driven primarily by the business side. Anytime a control was trying to be put in place, the business threw up their hands saying, we're a research organization. We have to be able to do what we need to do. You can't control any of this stuff. There's all these reasons why you couldn't do this stuff. And so there are probably folks on the call that are in this situation today, in which they know what good practice is, they know what they need to do, but they can't do it because there's this culture of, you can't restrict what we're doing. And unfortunately, I'll say what ends up happening 9 times out of 10 is what happened in this organization, in which you had to have something happen before people would wake up and go, oh boy, that was really bad, we shouldn't do that. Because why was this really bad in this case is that, well, these organizations were funded by other people's money. And if they paid you to do something and they weren't able to keep it secret, well, then people didn't want to give them money anymore. So this really forced their hand. So the end result, because every time I've told this story, people say, well, kind of what happened to them. They're still a research organization today. They're still viable. but they operate with a lot of controls around what's going on. And they work in teams in which these controls are actually put around the teams to make sure data doesn't get lost. So they made it. They were able to recognize that their culture was a bad culture and that they had no security that was traveling with their data, and that their data was very sensitive to loss. All it took was one person to get angry with them, and all of a sudden that data was lost, and it cost them a lot of money. So the next thing I wanted to share is probably one of my most interesting topics, because I'm going to pick on a Microsoft product that you may or may not have heard about, and it's called Microsoft Delve. If you're not aware of what Microsoft Delve is, and I know what's going to happen as soon as I start talking about, is that if your organization is migrated to Office 365, Delve was automatically triggered. And what is Delve? Well, Delve, in my mind, is Microsoft's largest contribution to being anti-privacy and compliance, because what it allows you to do is look up any person in your organization, and it will show you thumbnails of what they're working on. And at the time, I was working for an organization that had converted, and we found Delve pretty quickly. It was actually within a couple of days. And I went to the head of legal and clicked on their name, and immediately saw 4 documents that the legal person was working on. And you could clearly see in the names of the files themselves what they were. And the thumbnails were so large, I could actually read the very first page of the document. And so we brought in a whole bunch of people, showed, hey, this is what's happening. This is really bad. Everybody went, wow, this is really bad. And so we actually shut it down. So right now, I know there's probably people going off and trying to find Microsoft Delve in their environment. Bring it back to the presentation. Let's finish this story so you can see what we're talking about. But the reason why I bring a product like this up, especially in organizations that have already converted to or are moving to an Office 365 environment, once it's all shoved up into the cloud and all your data's been converted and all that kind of stuff, anything bad moves along with it. A lot of organizations just go, well, whatever we have today, just mimic what that and push it all up to the cloud, rights, anything like that, data. And so that's what companies do. And what happened in this particular case, financial services company rushing to Office 365 migration. How many people on the call actually have ever been trained on how to manage the rights to a SharePoint container or to a Teams container? Probably you were. You showed up, it was on your endpoint, you had to figure out how to use it, right? And especially like older versions of SharePoint, it was scary if you went to go change the rights. There'd be warning, you're going to be breaking the inheritance, blah, 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 blah. And people go, ooh, I don't think I want to do that. And so they wouldn't make any changes. And what happened slowly over time is repositories became more and more public facing without any controls around them. And what Delve did is it highlighted that, hey, wait a second, I could go to the CEO and open one of the CEO's documents because there was no controls over that. Again, stop looking at Delve, come back to the presentation. I know it's tempting, right? But you can do that in probably another 15 minutes. But what happens is that we take whatever was bad on-prem and we push it up to the cloud, and it's then equally as bad in the cloud. When it's in the cloud, now you can start to search across all of these environments and find data that you probably shouldn't have access to. So what this exposed is that this rush migration to Office 365, and actually I'll say I don't know if there's any such thing as a non-rush migration to Office 365. What it did is it opened up all of this sensitive data that was in the organization. So how did we deal with this? Immediate action, we turned off Delve. You can actually do that. We went and immediately disabled it so people could no longer get to Delve. There's another side thing that I'll talk about, which is you can actually go to a SharePoint root site and you can actually search every SharePoint container that's in the environment and still find sensitive data. But the first thing, get that Delve thing off, right? It's not a help to your organization if you're worried about privacy and compliance. The second action is that in this particular case, they're classifying data, but they weren't doing anything with it. So if you have classification, that data is moving all over the place. It's moving to shared containers, it's moving to containers within SharePoint, And if you have it classified, guess what? There's at-rest scanning that you can go and take a look and go, wait a second, here's a lot of sensitive data or things that are classified as sensitive data, and they're in open containers. Then you can take action on it. So all the repositories that we had that contain sensitive data, then there was a mandatory biannual review. But remember, setting, being able to set proper permissions in containers is a little scary, a little hard to do, and we have so much turnover in our organizations that just because Bob was doing it, well, what's Sally going to do the next time when Sally comes along? Is she going to know what to do? And even who these people are that have access to these containers, that's probably a bigger problem. So the fourth action is encryption. If you're sharing data, especially in public containers, box.com, sharefile.com, whatever the container happens to be that you're sharing data within, we implemented an encryption practice that almost regardless of who had access to that container, if they don't have access to the file, they don't have access to the file. And I jokingly say that if you properly use a good tool that allows you to track your data and apply encryption like our Vera product, then people, even if they may possess the file, won't have access to the file. Today, in the world we live in, for the most part, if you have possession of the file, you have access to the file, right? If you use encryption, and it's way more intuitive. If I'm sharing a file with Bob at Fortran.com, I give Bob at Fortran.com rights to be able to see the file. I'm not having to manage these containers and who has access and who are these people in these containers. It's a much easier one-to-one relationship if you use that encryption part. So out of all of this, if you take away, you got to manage these containers, but also to get people to understand what they're doing, bring it down to the file level. Remember, we said at the beginning of this presentation, data is our most valuable asset now, right? So let's put some control around it. Let's make something that's easier for consumers and people to understand, and let's bring it down to the file level. So, the last story I believe I have here is talking about encryption and saving profits. So what happens in a lot of organizations, I've worked in the insurance business, I've worked in the banking business, I've worked in healthcare, and we tend to do things to ourselves that encourages loss. In the insurance industry, everybody buys life insurance at the end of the year. It's all compacted into 2 months kind of thing. Healthcare, a lot of the same things. Enrollment periods start in September and they end in October, and everybody rushes through things. Or as an organization, when you're trying to organize, your next year goals with your partners and selling goals and things like that, we tend to compact things into small periods of time. But what that does is that encourages loss. I get it, we have to do it, it's part of the process, but in this particular case, this was a financial services company that was doing exactly that. They basically had no salespeople. Everything was done through partnership relationships. And the profits on their products was actually pretty high. So they had a lot of room to negotiate. They had a lot of room to make changes and negotiate partner by partner. And they did this all in a very short period of time. So it was this fast and furious, everybody's working 12, 14 hours a day. Negotiations were going back and forth like you wouldn't believe. And because they had highly profitable products, it came down to how good was somebody at negotiating, their deal as far as it goes. And the funny part about this whole thing is when they got to the end of all these negotiations, they pretty much knew within plus or minus 10% how much they're going to make in the next year. It was a fascinating process. But because it was this fast and furious process that they did, and that it was so condensed that people were working long hours, they were working at a furious pace, and they were working with literally the, hey, Sally, go and send company XYZ their spreadsheet kind of thing, yelling over cubes and stuff like that. It's kind of exciting and energizing and kind of draining at the same time. So what happened is they had a really bad file naming convention. And one of the individuals with one of those folks shouting out across the room to go send somebody a spreadsheet went and sent the internal spreadsheet to the partner. And what it included on that internal spreadsheet was the margins they were going to make in the next year, which were millions and millions of dollars. And what essentially this was going to do was expose to that partner, hey, we're going to go and make all this money off of you. Isn't this fabulous? So really bad situation. So the panic ensued, right? Oh my, I just sent the wrong thing. If you've ever tried to recall an email in Outlook, you'll find how hard it actually is and how it basically throws up warnings to you saying, hey, yeah, you can try it, but it don't know if it's really going to work all that well. So thankfully, this organization classified their information, and as a part of the classification, the more sensitive internal stuff automatically applied encryption to it. So here comes back that encryption save again, right? So because we can't control where this data goes, in a lot of cases, you send a file out, you send a spreadsheet out, and once it's gone, it's gone. It could be shared 8 million times, and you'd have no clue that it's going on. Actually, internally, that happens too. I can share a file with one of my colleagues who can then go reshare it multiple times. I'm none the wiser that this is happening in the background other than a little green icon in OneDrive. So how can you actually start to control some of this stuff? And that's via adding some encryption. And in this particular case, the good news is that it actually did apply encryption. And the rule that the company had at the time is if I went and attached it and shared it to bob@fortran.com, it would give Bob those rights to that file. But because of the tool itself, we were actually able to remove the rights to that person that received the file before they even opened it. So crisis was averted. That data was not shared or seen by the partner, and millions of dollars weren't lost. And then, of course, everybody did the, hey, make sure you know what you're sending kind of thing. So the key to this was classification, triggering encryption was key to that save. The damage to the profitability of the organization probably would have been quite large if it actually gotten out. And I couldn't imagine what the negotiation would have been for that partner if they had actually seen the margins out there, which again were extensive. So to bring this kind of all together is I actually want to talk about some of the themes to success. Because there's actually a right way to be doing this stuff, right? And the first thing I want to highlight that in each case, there are electronic controls in place or needed to be put in place. The one organization that had no controls, they experienced a rather embarrassing loss that if it would have continued to happen, it would have shut the company down. And I'm not saying this just because I'm a vendor and I sell tools and stuff like that. Is we've experienced it over and over again. Remember, I was a consumer of these things, helping consult companies in controlling what's happening in their organization. And so, this is the only vendor slide you're going to see in the entire presentation in which I'm just going to say you have to have tools for success. And when we talk about tools for success, you want them to be flexible and expansive enough that they can meet your use cases. If you're using a product right now and you're finding out that I'm having to give up on my use cases because the tool can't do it, then that's probably not the right tool that's going to provide you longevity. So you have to take a look at the tools that you have and figure out where their limitations or boundaries are, because we're in a crazy, ever-changing world. There's laws, regulations, rules, contractual obligations popping out all the time. So we have to make sure we have tools that are flexible enough to meet need. And then you've heard this theme pop up a couple of times as I talked about, is that you have to have the right partners for success. Legal, privacy, and compliance are your friends in security. They truly, truly are, because they're the ones that are creating the policies that you're enforcing. And if you sit down and agree to some of those boundaries, and what tools can you use? Well, remember we talked about the culture thing. Well, those are your partners. They're going to help you break down some of those barriers. And I understand, I get it. Sometimes their voices aren't loud enough, but work together on that. These are truly your partners to help expand what you're doing. And the most important thing out of all of this stuff is leadership support. And I make a really, kind of statement here, which I say, if you don't have their support, don't even try. And I know that's like really, wow, that's kind of a broad, rather damning statement to make, but the number of times I've walked into an organization in which they've had failed implementations or they've had failed processes that they tried to implement, it's because there was no leadership support whatsoever. In the case of that company that had the culture problem, it was the leaders that stood up and said, okay, this ends now. It doesn't have to be that dramatic, but it was the leaders that stepped up and helped get that culture changing in the face of a business that said, oh, no, we can't do any of this stuff. So that is the first thing you have to work on if you don't have a lot of good control in place. And then finally, I have to say this over and over again. Complexity does not equal security. The more complex you make something, the more people work around it. And so I love this photo here about this road with a barrier and a little light snowfall is coming. You can clearly see all the tracks of people going around the barrier. The more barriers you put up, the more complex you make it, the more people will use energy to work around you. Happens all the time. And then, companies always try to boil the ocean or go to 11 on their first try at this. And I know sometimes in certain corporate cultures, it's hard to say, hey, we need to start slow and work into this. But I can tell you from a lot of organizations I've walked into that if they go to 11, they go to the complexity part first, and then they try to start walking back some of these controls, it is near impossible. You almost have to start fresh all over again. So try to convince the people that you work with, try to convince the leadership that it's easier to actually start simple and increase your complexity as need shows you need to, versus going really complex and trying to walk it back. So that's it. That's what I have for you today. Hopefully some of those stories rang true with you, some of those things. And I know you're all like rushing off to Delve right now to go and see what you can see within your company. Don't do that. Just go shut it down. I don't know. People maybe had to come up, but Mike, if there's anything that we can address.
Great. No, I think that's it. Thanks again, Wade, for sharing this information with us today. I want to let everyone know that a recording will be shared with you shortly. Please do pass that on to colleagues who are unable to make the call today. And please don't hesitate to reach out if there's something we can help you with or if you have any further questions. Also, be on the lookout for a post-webinar survey that should be coming to you guys shortly after we finish up here. But that's all for me for now. So if everyone is good, we are okay to disconnect. And thanks again for joining.
Thank you all. Have a good day.